morning, everyone. Welcome to this URBC session. Today, we're super excited to have you all joining us from wherever you're joining us. My name is Journeay. I will be your host for today's session, and also with my team members, we'll be presenting information as part of our session today, which I'll introduce in a moment. But before we go there, just a few minutes to get us oriented to the session itself and to what to expect over the next couple of hours. I want to start by, as we often do, just giving gratitude and acknowledgement for where I'm coming to you from today, which is up in Squamish, on the traditional lands of the Squamish people. And it's a landscape that always inspires me, but it always teaches as well. This community knows how to live with risk and has demonstrated that for centuries. And so it's a good reminder for me every time I walk outside. So I want to give gratitude for that. Today's session is focusing on some new information and some new approaches for looking at earthquake risk and other risks for the Metro Vancouver region. And I'll get into and we'll introduce the session shortly, but that's what we're here to focus on for the next little bit. I wanted to start by also thanking our URBC sponsors for this year. Putting on these events is a big lift, and we lean quite heavily on the community, and they've stepped up again this year. So we have very generous support from Natural Resources Canada, the Canadian Safety and Security Program, IBC, the Office of Housing and Construction Standards, BGC, EERI, the BC Real Estate Association, and the Engineers and Geoscientists of BC. And you can tell from their sponsors that we have a kind of a cross-section of folks from public, private, academic sectors, all kind of active in this field. If you're into it, and we hope you are, please shout out today's session using the hashtag URBC 2020. And this is gonna be very much an engagement kind of session where we're gonna be interacting together throughout the next hour and a half. And I'll kind of orient us when we get to that part of the program. So just giving us some context for what we're doing here today. In the opening session for this whole symposium, we kind of framed what we're doing here as really looking at the job of implementing the Sendai framework at a local regional scale. And we kind of looked at the steps that are needed to help navigate a path toward disaster resilience. And the sessions, if you look on the left, the sessions that we've had leading up to this point have touched on various aspects of this strategy, either helping us to understand the risk from a flood or earthquake perspective, helping us understand what we might do about those risks, so the different choices, policy choices and strategies. So we looked at a range of things. The last few sessions have been really foundational for what we're going to do here today. Shaping Our Future Resilient Metro Vancouver really set the stage for regional planning here in the region. And the question that they posed and we're posing again today is, how do we bring a disaster resilience lens to these large regional planning efforts? The one that followed, Beyond Death, Dollars, and Downtime, really introduced the idea of functional recovery, which is central to what we're going to be talking about here today. And so here we are at the Black Swan session, and I'll introduce where we're headed from here at the end of this. So I'll get started by introducing our session today. We call it Black Swans, and I'll explain that in a second. But we're really focusing on some new information from our risk and recovery models that we think might be helpful in informing disaster resilience planning here in the region. And so we're both introducing some new information, but we're also introducing some new approaches, and we're really interested to get your thoughts and perspectives on how we're doing. So we'll start with setting some context and motivation for this work. That'll be a very brief overview. I'll then, on behalf of our team, introduce our project, which is called Pathways, and how we're approaching this work. And then it's our turn to do a deep dive into some hotspots of concern in the region, and I'll introduce these shortly. So we're going to look at risk hotspots in the Vancouver Harbour area and Kingsway Arterial. And we really want to work with you to kind of understand your perspectives on risk and recovery. And then we'll close out with some thoughts about how we use this information to think about taking it back into our practice. So what are black swans anyway, and why did we use that as our title? Many of you probably know or may know that black swans was coined to refer to very rare events, but events that through history have had significant socioeconomic consequences. We could list them off, but we're in the middle of one right now. The pandemic would be considered a black swan event. And we know that we're exposed to significant earthquake risk and can expect a catastrophic earthquake here in the region. So these are black swan events. They're not easily predicted, but after they happen, they seem obvious. The other characteristic, and one we're going to focus on here today, is that the initial impacts get amplified by orders of magnitude. So it's not enough to just measure the initial impacts. We really need to understand the cascading failures through the system. And also what we're going to focus on here today is these black swan events typically reveal underlying socioeconomic inequities. And so we're going to try and bring a light on how these risks in our region are impacting the most vulnerable in our communities. And it's interesting, you know, that we look at the drivers of risk, and if we the map on the left is a map showing the intensity of ground shaking that we can expect here in the region, with the darker reds indicating high and extreme levels of ground shaking. And the chart on the right looks at the numbers of people who are exposed to those ground shaking intensities over time. So we've essentially doubled the number of people living in harm's way, essentially, is the takeaway from this slide. We now have over 3.5 million people living in areas where they're exposed to ground shaking that could cause significant damage. And we know that risk is really concentrated at the intersection of hazard and exposure. And so this map tries to bring some focus to that. So the map on the left shows, is basically painting the population grid with the hazard susceptibility. So the darker the color there, the more ground shaking people are exposed to. And you can see the hotspots are in Vancouver, where we'll focus today, but also elsewhere in the Georgia Basin region. So we're focusing on Metro Vancouver today because we have about 2.5 million people that are exposed to, just in the Metro Vancouver region, exposed to these significant hazards, these black swan type events. And to understand the impacts, we have in this project put together a very high resolution urban risk model, which starts with the hazards, of course, but also it lays the foundation of infrastructure. This is our systems approach to this problem. So we look at transportation, we look at water, wastewater systems, we look at energy systems, we look at essential facilities, and we look at it through the lens of not only the physical assets, but also the services they provide. And so we've dug deep to try and understand these systems, who they serve, and the services they provide. Introducing today is a new, very detailed risk model for at the building level, at the asset level, for about 500,000 buildings, 460,000 buildings in the region. Here colored by land use. So we get a sense of how we're settled in the region here by looking at this map. And the other thing that we've been able to do is, I'm going to peel away the residential component. We've been able to bring a spotlight to businesses that are operating in the region and exposed to these earthquake risks. And so we're going to dig into these patterns shortly. So don't try to take it all in now. This is just setting the stage. And these are the two hotspots that we'll go to very shortly. The Vancouver Harbour will take us to the shores of Vancouver, Falls Creek, Vancouver Harbour, and North Vancouver. The Kingsway Arterial will focus on our transportation corridors and the mix of land use in those regions. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to rename yourself, and we'll go over how that's going to happen. But we're going to ask you to pick one of those hotspot regions and indicate with the letter A or B in front of your name which one you'd like to be part of, and that will give us a chance to get you into the right spot. And I'll go over what we're going to do in detail when we get there. So that'll be the first breakout session. The second breakout session after we come back will be shifting our focus from looking at hotspots of concern to thinking about what specific actions might we consider. And so we really look forward to your thoughts and ideas on how to move us beyond this point. We're going to use Mentimeter as our polling foundation today. And so I'm going to ask you to, whatever device is handy for you, just type in menti.com into a browser, and that should take you to a poll. It'll ask you for a code, and the number that you want to type in there is up at the top of the screen here. That number is 9455627. And I'm just going to give you a moment. There's two questions here, and you'll see, and just take your time to go through them at your own pace. But the first question is really getting at areas of interest and or contribution to this whole field. And so you've got 100 points here. So think of these as buckets and allocate 10 points for each of these categories that reflects your interest and or contribution in this field. And the second question is really kind of getting at our thoughts, at least as we start this session, on what we think at this point are our greatest concerns in terms of earthquake impacts for this region. And we'll revisit this at the end of the session, but we're interested to get your perspectives. I also wanted to really encourage you to make use of capability to engage with each other today, but really jump on the chat session. If you have questions, if you have concerns, if you have thoughts that you want to share with people, please use the chat freely as a way to communicate with us, but also as a way to communicate with your colleagues. So feel free to start a conversation. Our session is being recorded today, so we'll be able, at least for the plenaries, we'll be able to come back. Okay, so thanks for taking the time to do that. And we're going to shift gears now, and my job for the next 5 minutes, and we're going to have 5-minute presentations by each of our team members. And my job for the next 5 minutes is to set the stage for the project and the information that we're bringing forward today. The project is called Pathways, and it is a project funded by the Canadian Safety and Security Program. And really, it's about helping us envision a safer and more resilient future. And it's our job here is really to think about how to bring the science and the policy planning pieces together into more of a holistic approach. And we have a really exciting team of folks that cover the gamut from people that do risk assessments, quantitative risk assessments and recovery models, to people that have got quite a bit of background in doing scenario modeling from a planning perspective. So thinking about using our models in different ways to not only measure impacts, but measure opportunities. But we also have a really strong team of folks that are on the ground doing this work day after day in various organizations at different levels of government who are providing us just vital input on the kind of information that they need to support the work that they're doing. So this project is unique in that way, in that it brings together the science and policy folks to one project. And it also builds on a tremendous amount of work that's happening internationally. So this team is connected to the research community and policy community here in Canada, but also internationally. And we really are framing our work around the Sendai mandate, which was introduced by the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction in 2015. And it really focused attention on targets and indicators, and that's also what we're going to focus on today. They range from specific goals for reducing impacts to people, loss of life, reducing economic losses, reducing the disruption to our systems, our community systems. But it also focuses on strategies that increase our capacities. And again, this is a message that you'll hear us talk about today. When Sendai was introduced in 2015, this particular session was at the Global Earthquake Model Foundation launch in 2015. And I happened to be there just a couple months before working with colleagues. And you might notice some of our colleagues in the audience here. So these folks have been thinking about it for a while. And the path toward a safer and more resilient future is one that the international community has been engaged in for some time, since the mid-1980s. But I want to focus your attention on around 2015 when Sendai was introduced. Simultaneous to that were other international initiatives around the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Agreement for Climate Change, Adaptation, and the New Urban Agenda. So this is a significant juncture in our evolution here, in that it's an opportunity to bring a systemic lens to disaster risk resilience planning. It's also an opportunity to think about how we can integrate disaster risk reduction with community planning. And the vision is really leading us toward a more risk-informed process of planning, sustainable development. So that's our roadmap. And we've kind of boiled it down to this kind of iterative map where we're asking the question, so what does it take? Like, what do we need to do? What capacities do we need? What information do we need to really support an implementation of Sendai at a regional level and really build our capacity toward a risk-informed sustainable development practice? And we know that people are receptive to the ideas, but we also know that they need a pretty strong value proposition to take action. And because of that, and because of the inaction, we know that our risk trends are continuing to increase, and it's a hard curve to flatten. So we look for miracles, and we don't have a solution, a miracle solution for you, but we are focusing on the opportunities that risk information bring to the table. It's a base of evidence that's represented by very high resolution urban risk and recovery models. They don't address all of our questions, but they are starting to address more than we had before. And we think they bring to the table a really important base of evidence to both inform, but also to empower actions that we could take. And while we don't have a crystal ball, as risk analysts and modelers, we can use models to help us understand causes and effects. And so we use quantitative risk assessment to develop what we call baseline risk scenarios for current and anticipated futures. And they really help answer the question, what can we expect in terms of impacts and consequences? And these models are used routinely in various fields, but certainly in emergency management to understand the immediate impacts and how to build capacities to manage those impacts. But the project goes a bit further in that we also use these same models to underpin the development of planning scenarios. So these planning scenarios really look at modeling the effective actions that we can take in advance, and they help us identify opportunities for risk reduction through this lens of risk tolerance. How do we get to a place that's a more desirable future than where we are right now? So that's really what the planning scenarios do. And this is really to lead toward increased capacity to bring this information to the table for community planners and others who are thinking about this region in the future. With any of these strategic planning initiatives, they often, where they blend science and policy, they depend on a strong framework of indicators that can be used to inform specific decisions or a mix of decisions, trade-offs between different policy choices. So we bring to the table indicators that measure impacts to the built environment, and we'll go through these shortly. But what's new, and we think innovative, is we also bring to the table a range of indicators that look at and measure the strain on social fabric. So this is new. What's also new is we're bringing these two threads of modeling into the frame of functional recovery. So we're not only just looking at the immediate impacts and consequences, but we're asking the question, how do these impacts and consequences translate into recovery profiles at the neighborhood level? And so that's really our focus for today. Again, we're going to focus on risk. So this is now a risk map for the two hotspot areas. And you can see why we chose these hotspot regions. They are regions where we have concentrated levels of seismic risk that impact not only our communities, our neighborhoods, but again, if I peel away the residential component and we just look at our businesses, a really important story here is that our business community would be also severely impacted by a major event, and that's going to have consequences for us all. I'll go through this super quick because we'll get into the details. So we bring to the table the sequence of metrics, the hazards, of course, but we measure building damage and downtime and how those impacts are distributed across the built environment. What's driving those damage hotspots. We look at the implications for critical injury and entrapment immediately following an earthquake, and again, which building types are likely to be the hotspots of concern. We look at how the damage translates into economic losses and where those losses are concentrated in our built environment. And again, we're going to be introducing this idea of how we measure the strain on social fabric with a focus on those buildings that provide business functions to all of us. So these are the indicators that measure direct impacts and consequences. We also are going to be introducing, and I'll pass over to my team shortly here, this idea of functional recovery and models for functional recovery, where immediately after an earthquake, we can expect a degradation in system performance across the board, from our buildings, our transportation systems, lifelines, et cetera. And we want to understand what's the recovery path look like? What does that restoration path look like? And so we can use models to help give us an understanding of what we can expect. But we can also use those models to answer the question, how do we get to a better place? How do we use those models to define kind of an ideal place? So how do we get from orange to blue? And we know that one way we can do that is by increasing the resistance of our buildings. And there's many ways we can do that, and we'll talk about that later today. We also know that another strategy is to increase our capacity for the immediate response and recovery functions. And we know that that can accelerate the recovery, and we know that we can be strategic about how we do that. And thirdly, we will be introduced shortly to ideas and insights on how we might go about minimizing the burden of risk on our most vulnerable. And so with that, I'm going to pass over to my team.
So what I wanted to do in the next few minutes is start to focus in a bit more on this idea of functional recovery planning and how we want to use that concept to really think about how we could reduce disaster risk and the different ways that we might want to do that, and what our targets and goals might be in reducing disaster risk. So by way of sort of a brief example, let's consider the idea of the functions of a building. If we want to recover from a disaster or to have lowered impacts from a disaster, then we want those functions of the building to either persist through the disaster or to recover quite quickly following the disaster. And these functions could be the things in residential buildings like shelter and warmth and ablutions and food storage and preparation, or they could be the functions that exist within the businesses and critical facilities that the region relies upon. Now, to recover the functions in our buildings, there's several steps typically involved. So we could focus in on that process a little bit. So first, it starts with assessing building damage, accessing financing perhaps, acquiring permits, potentially even conducting design or creating designs if we're doing a significant reconstruction, and then performing repairs. So these are some core steps that are required to return the functions that we actually care about. And this process of returning functions requires services and operations that occur outside of the region, perhaps at the state or federal level, but also services that are provided within the region. So in a sense, to return the function of a building, we need the functions that exist in other places to aid us in that process. And within the set of functions at the local level, there's a range of different functions. And for the time being, let's take just a brief look at the functions that lifeline infrastructure provide and how they relate to this idea of functional recovery. So here we have a view of the Vancouver region, and let's consider two types of communities. At a high level, one of them is a high density community, and the other is a low density community. What we know is that the functions will recover at different times, in different places, and in different ways. So the experience of these two communities will be different. And they'll be different in at least the following ways. The damage that's experienced will be different, and the impact, the meaning of that damage will be different for the communities. There will be differences in what infrastructure is needed by different communities or different businesses. High-rise buildings, for example, have very different infrastructure needs than low-rise buildings. There are differences in where communities reside within overlapping infrastructure networks. So that means when there's an interruption to one type of infrastructure and an interruption to a different type of infrastructure, we're going to see that interruption play itself out in different ways across the region. Some regions might experience failure in one type of infrastructure and not another, and vice versa. And those interruptions will have differing effects on the communities. So one of the things that we'd like you to think about over the course of this session is, can the acceleration of functional restoration be sensitive to each of these differences? Can we, in our effort to reduce disaster risk, achieve an acceleration of the restoration of functions that is sensitive to what each community or each business really essentially needs? Thank you very much. With that, I'll turn it back over to the team.
Thanks very much, David. So David set the scene for this idea of functional recovery, and I would like to invite Paul Chouinard now to share some thoughts on kind of these interdependencies and how we go about thinking about these interdependencies and the implications for recovery. So over to Paul.
Hello, I'm Paul Chouinard from Defense R&D Canada. I've been an operational researcher for a long time. And since about 2008, I've been involved in the critical infrastructure, starting with work in support of the Vancouver Olympics. And since then, supporting Emergency Management BC, and then on to developing a national critical infrastructure model. And by national, I mean it's designed to be applicable anywhere in Canada at a different range, from community level all the way up to regional and perhaps even national level. The one thing I want to talk about here is there's been a shift from critical infrastructure, and it's still being called critical infrastructure, to more critical functions. And by function, we mean the ability to deliver a specified output. And that can be goods, services, information, and decisions or whatever. And critical functions are critical infrastructure functions, are those functions that deliver goods, services, and information that we deem to be essential for society. And in that regard, we measure not whether something's on or off, but the availability or percentage degradation. So there's two examples there: food stores and let's say a hospital. there's maybe around 1,200 food stores in the region, and in this particular hospital, that's 260 beds. Well, after the disaster, we may find that the functionality has been decreased and that only just over 300 food stores are operating, not just because they're physically damaged, but for various reasons, which I'll get into, and that the hospital might only be able to support something like 80 beds. So this is just a simple example. That the actual work we do is more complicated than this, but this just shows that when you look at the food stores, if you just take the earthquake damage to the facilities, you might get down to something like 1,000 food stores. When you add in the disruption of the supply chain, you're down to maybe 950. And when you look at the disruption of utilities in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, you'll find that you'll get down to your 300 in some food stores. The same thing with the hospital, reducing from 268 down to the 80 some. In terms of this, what we have is a taxonomy of about 900 functions divided into about 40 different industries across the various critical infrastructure sectors. We've mapped around 120,000 businesses to those functions within the region. Some of them are not necessarily critical infrastructure, but let's say general economy functions, but they've all been mapped, so we have a good impression of that. And the important thing about functions are it's not just the assets, but it's also the people, the workers, the information, everything else that's needed that you need to restore things to full functionality. So it isn't just the repair of the buildings, it's also getting the workers in. And so we can, with David's work as well, plot the functionality and how the blue line is just based on the buildings, and then the red line is taking all the other factors into account what that is. And this is just to say that if you just focus on your own industry, your own facilities, you might find that you don't get the degree of resilience you want. And so this is a case where hospitals might do okay, they've got their seismic upgrade and everything else. But if all the things that support the hospital, the things that take off the patient load from hospitals are disrupted, and you'll find that there's increased demand on the hospital, not just due to the disaster. And then that means that even if the hospital is fully functional, it's not meeting the demand. And therefore, the resilience, CI resilience is actually a community resilience.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Paul. And so we have just one last brief orientation to what does this all look like? What does this disaster recovery profile or path look like through the lens of a neighborhood and the people that live in that neighborhood? So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass over to my colleague, Jackie. Yep.
Thanks, Larry. Yeah, so I'd like to bring us back to the idea of integrated risk assessment, where we want to think of both the physical impact of a disaster as well as the strain on the social fabric. So we know that disasters can have impact on building performance, public safety, to economic losses. But when we think of how people can respond and recover from these impacts, depends on whether what is the level of financial agency, social connections, individual autonomy to react, and also housing conditions. However, each of these factors can play a very different role or have a different level of exacerbation on the impact, depending on the local context, as well as which kind of physical impact it interacts with. So they don't play equal roles. So we see them as factors that we need to consider to provide us with context to develop more targeted recovery support. So this brings us to maybe thinking of more targeted functional recovery. So in this sense, we want to keep these factors open to tell us how are they represented on the ground at a given place. To try to uncover how these social factors are typically represented in BC neighborhoods, we have developed something called neighborhood social vulnerability profiles, where we consider these 12 social demographic indicators reflecting these 4 aspects of social vulnerability, and identified 8 neighborhood profiles. So each are highlighting the social indicators that are overrepresented in the neighborhood compared to the provincial average. So these 8 profiles, starting with the first one, for example, we're talking about a neighborhood that could have higher than average racial and linguistic diversity, and also number of households that have an average income. The second profile we're looking at that might have a more complex set of social factors that can result in economic, social, and housing insecurity post-disaster. The third one, we're looking at a higher than average number of households that are living in unaffordable and rental housing. While another profile would be maybe they have higher than average number of young families and individuals with job insecurity. The fifth profile, we're looking at neighborhoods with higher than average number of high income households and 2-parent families. The sixth profile, we are looking at similarly high income households, but with lone parent families. And then the seventh one, we're looking at a neighborhood that might have more than average number of newcomers and households with very low income and potential of post-disaster housing insecurity. And the last one is our neighborhoods that might have higher than average population of seniors and lower income households. So we can see these 8 profiles have these social factors represented in quite different ways. So if we map each of the BC neighborhoods to one of these 8 profiles, we can get a quick sense of how neighborhoods can be vulnerable in different ways. So if we map those 8 profiles onto neighborhoods in the Metro Vancouver area, we get this map showing us, we can quickly see how we can have quite a diverse range of neighborhoods even within individual municipalities, which tells us that different types of neighborhoods may need quite different types of support in recovering from different disaster impacts. So if we bring this back to the functional recovery planning, after the services are disrupted at the onset of the disaster, there can be, as Murray has presented, there might be an estimated rate of recovery of that service. And then there is the ideal rate of restoration that is ideal for a given type of business or a given type of neighborhood. But the gap in between the two, maybe we can consider that as the service resilience gap. And so if we consider that, we want to understand how can we narrow this gap. We need to understand how does this gap look like for different types of neighborhood. And then we want to think of what are the different actions we can do to bring these two together. So I'll bring this back to Murray.
Thanks, Jackie. And I wanted to just orient you to what we're going to do. So this will be an introduction to your breakouts. So we've presented this new information and this new approach. So the new information will be presented to you on a screen that looks like this. So the physical impacts will be presented in a map in the upper left-hand corner. And we'll go through a couple of impacts. We don't have time to go through them all, but just a few sample impacts. And on the upper right will be a map that shows the distribution of that impact across the neighborhoods that Jackie just profiled. And what's new here is we're bringing those two measures together into one view. So those two maps then get integrated into a chart that'll look like this. It's a bar chart that shows the distribution of that impact across the neighborhoods. And we'll review this again when we get into breakout. But what I want to highlight is that we're not only presenting information about the impacts, we're also presenting information about the opportunities. So there'll be a second graph that'll show the opportunity to reduce risk. And we're going to present that information, and then we're going to ask you to do two things. So we're going to go back to the Mentimeter polls, and we'll each introduce them. We're going to ask you to assess the physical impact and strain on social fabric from your perspective, your level of concern for that impact on people and critical assets. And we're also going to ask you to assess the opportunity for risk reduction for that impact. So those are the two things we're going to do. And with that, and I do apologize, we're running just a little bit over. I'm going to invite you all to go to breakouts. So Serena will be helping us keep track of what we learned together today. So don't worry about the notes. We'll share them back to you. And with that, I kind of gave you a hint of what we're going to do, and I think we're just going to launch right into it. And so I am going to share my screen again. And so here we are. We're going to focus on the Vancouver Harbor, and you each have some knowledge or expertise about this region, or perhaps you're just interested. We're going to start by setting the frame with the exposure. And so you can see that in the Vancouver Harbor area, the blue numbers kind of indicate the numbers of buildings, people, and assets, and the gray numbers underneath of the region overall. And the takeaway here is that the city of Vancouver represents about almost 70% of the exposure in this region. And if you look at the contribution to the overall region, it represents about 30% of the whole region. So really just the only thing I wanted to get to tease out initially is to set some context for what we're going to look at here. So the assets and the impacts we're looking at represent about 30% of the overall risk profile for the whole region. In terms of risk, the impacts range in terms of how they contribute to the overall risk profile, but generally what we're finding in many of these hotspot regions, the two that we picked today, they contribute about 30% or more to the overall risk profile for the region. And I want to draw your attention to a couple that stand out for our area. Life-threatening injuries and social disruption are the two metrics that really are higher than the mean for many of the other regions, and those are the ones that we'll spend some time focusing on. So again, I'm going to ask you to go to your device and go to menti.com. I'm going to give you a minute to navigate there, and we're going to keep the poll running for this whole breakout session. And I want to invite you to, as we go through, I'm going to be presenting as kind of your tour guide. I'm going to be presenting kind of highlights of the impacts. And we're going to ask you to kind of rank your level of concern about those impacts across this hotspot region. And the second part of that question is we're going to ask you to assess, in your view, what you think the potential for risk reduction is. And we're going to show you those charts that show how much we can reduce risk. So we're really just asking for your assessment of one, your level of concern, and two, what you think the opportunity for risk reduction is for that particular impact. And so the way that's going to work, and we're going to do a practice one right now. So I'll show you very briefly how that's going to work. So I'll start with the indicator that we're going to focus on. So this is building performance. And so I'm going to highlight the number of buildings here that are damaged beyond repair. That represents about 25% or so of the overall contribution of risk to the whole region. And then I'll show a map, something like this. And this particular map is a map that's showing for this indicator, which is building damage. These are locations where buildings exceed minimum thresholds for severe damage. So every dot on this map represents a building that has potential for some damage. This doesn't mean that these buildings are falling down or killing people. It just means that these buildings are likely to sustain significant levels of damage that would require inspection. And the size of the circles represents the level of impact. Think of it that way for each of these indicators. So the bigger circles are showing us where the impacts are concentrated. And there'll be two colors on every one of these maps, blue and red. The blue dots are residential buildings, and the red dots are non-residential. They could be commercial, industrial, or civic buildings. So that's how that's going to work. And basically the maps are there to kind of draw your attention to where the hotspots are. And then I'm not going to go into the detailed neighborhood plots, but then I'm going to show you a graph like this that breaks out the impacts by the building function on the left-hand side. So in this case, we're looking at building damage, and you can see right away in these charts that most of the damage is concentrated in our low density residential neighborhoods and in commercial and industrial neighborhoods. So that's where most of the impact is concentrated. And so I'll show you these kinds of charts, and in this case, you can see the damage is concentrated in wood. So that's how these charts will work. And then I'll show you something like this for the indicator that will show you the level of risk reduction. So just try it out. This is a practice run for building damage on menti.com for the first indicator on building damage. Just indicate your level of concern, just kind of looking at this graph and the information presented. And then the second question is based on the risk reduction that you see here and that we're trying to highlight. What's your sense? Like, do you feel that there is lots of opportunity here if we were, able to take advantage of all opportunities to reduce risk? What's your sense of what that opportunity looks like? Is it high, medium, low, somewhere in between? We're just trying to get a sense of how people think about these impacts, not only to the built environment, but also to people and where the opportunities might lie. Yeah, so this is our tour. I'm really excited to share this information with you. So we're going to move on to, we've looked at building damage, which is really kind of the foundation for pretty much everything. So now we're going to focus now on the downstream consequences of building damage, starting with public safety. So how does building damage translate into critical injuries? And these are, what we're measuring here are life-threatening injuries. These aren't deaths, but these are people who would sustain serious injuries that would require specialized medical care, likely transport to a hospital, and some proportion of these folks may lose their lives. But these are likely entrapment injuries. These are people in buildings that have physically been compromised and either partially or completely collapsed. So think of Christchurch and the people in those buildings. And so here's the map. And this map is showing just the distribution of those injuries. And I want to draw your attention to just two things. One, there's both red and blue dots. And if you just focus on the bigger size dots, you can see that there is a reasonably equal distribution of injuries between residential buildings and commercial buildings. And you can see that those severe injuries are distributed throughout the region, but also concentrated in a few hotspot regions. For example, the Lower Lonsdale area on the North Shore, you can see there's some concentration of injuries in both residential and commercial buildings. And also in the Vancouver downtown east side, you can see there's some concentrations there. But as you scan the map, you'll see there's some other hotspots elsewhere in the region that we want to pay attention to. So that's how this impact lays out on this region. So now we're going to look at how those injuries are distributed across the built environment. So we're initially now focusing just on physical impacts. The injuries, and you can see that they're mostly concentrated in commercial and industrial buildings. And when we dig into this a little bit, we learned that these are largely, if you look on the right-hand side, these are largely concrete, older concrete buildings that were never designed to sustain the level of shaking that we can expect here. Or they're unreinforced masonry buildings also perform very poorly in levels of ground shaking that we can expect. And the injuries are, although largely concentrated in commercial buildings, they are distributed across civic buildings. So these would be schools and government facilities, and into medium and high density buildings. And what's important here for this metric is that we have a lot of older concrete buildings that house, that are multifamily buildings. Think of older concrete buildings in your neighborhood that are condominiums. That's what we're talking about. For the commercial buildings, we're talking about, again, older concrete, or in some cases, wood buildings with big openings on the ground floor, or masonry buildings. These are typically our older buildings. They're in the older parts of our city centers. But look at this. We have some opportunity here across the range for reducing the level of critical injury. So now let's look at how these impacts lay out on our neighborhoods. And so bear in mind, we've got 195 critical injuries. The map on the right, the size of the circle is kind of drawing our attention to where those injuries are concentrated and the neighborhoods that they represent. And so you can either look at the map, or probably the easier way to get a sense of this impact on the neighborhoods of concern to you is by looking at the bar chart down below. And almost immediately you can see what jumps out are impacts to unaffordable rental housing. These typically tend to be lower income neighborhoods, but also impacts, higher than average impacts to neighborhoods with high racial and linguistic diversity, kind of mean income neighborhoods, but also impacts to higher income neighborhoods in the region. And then the other impacts are distributed. So this is really, so if you're on menti.com, this is really, we're at that first question. You've seen kind of the physical impacts of we're now talking about critical injuries. We've looked at how those injuries are distributed, and we're now looking at how those impacts are what the consequences of those impacts are on these neighborhoods. And we're asking you to kind of gauge your level of concern using the menti.com poll. Use the slider bar to kind of push it one way or the other to indicate your level of concern for this impact. Okay, so the second part of that question is, what do you think is the opportunity for risk reduction? And again, I'm just summarizing the places where we can reduce risk and the neighborhoods that would benefit from those interventions. So I'll ask you to rank what you think the opportunity for risk reduction is here. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to move us on to the next impact. And we'll go through the next one, the next two very quickly. Now that you have the hang of how this works. The patterns will be pretty similar, so don't worry about taking it all in. Just really focus on your level of concern and opportunities. So this next one is we're looking at essentially downtime. So after the earthquake, buildings are damaged to different levels, and as Paul mentioned, that level of damage translates into a recovery time that's influenced by not only how long it takes to restore the building function, but also what services you need in place in order to do that. And the loss of service of buildings has an implication on disruption of people, either in their homes or businesses. And so this map is showing us where those hotspot areas are, again, distributed between residential and non-residential, and in the similar hotspots as we saw before. The pattern breaks out a little bit differently here. So most of the people disrupted by loss of function of their buildings are in these older concrete, medium and high density buildings, less so in lower density residential neighborhoods. And as you can see on these charts, there's opportunity here to significantly reduce disruption by about 125,000 people. So the total expected is about 230,000, but we could reduce the number of people disrupted by 126,000. So again, we're going to ask you on menti.com to think about these impacts and who they're impacting. You can see the patterns are very similar here. The same two neighborhoods, the same three neighborhoods pop out here in this chart. But what's different, and I want to draw your attention to here, is the opportunity for risk reduction and its influence on minimizing social disruption. Okay, I hope I'm not rushing you too much. I realize this is a lot to ask. But Sahar, can you give me a thumbs up or down if this is going at an okay pace? I can see you in the gallery view. Just thumbs up, okay? Great, thank you. Okay, so we have one last indicator, and then if we have time, we'll chat a little bit about what we saw. This last one is focusing on economic impacts. And this is really a question about economic security. We can expect about $5.6 billion in direct economic losses. So these are ground up losses to homes and businesses. And this represents about 34% or so of the total risk profile. We're familiar now with where the hotspots are, so I won't draw them out again here. They are distributed across residential and commercial. And you can see that the patterns are a little bit different here. Most of the economic losses are concentrated in low density residential neighborhoods. And that's simply because there's so many buildings. They represent 85% of the overall portfolio. So that's why we're seeing these patterns. And with proactive investment and mitigation, we have an opportunity to reduce expected losses from 5.6 down. We can reduce those losses by about $1.4 billion. So that will have a big impact on the financial security of individuals. And if we look at who's bearing those consequences, again, you can see these same three neighborhoods are bearing the brunt of the losses. And so again, this last time on Menti, your sense of this, your overall concern for this impact, economic loss on these neighborhoods, on these folks. And with investment in mitigation, you can see the map on the upper left. I'll just go to the previous one. You can see the map on the upper left changes substantially. That pattern of loss is very different now if we were able to enact mitigation policy and reduce the impact to the buildings. And these are the losses. And I think the point I want to emphasize here as you're voting and finishing up on the voting process is that the opportunities vary across the neighborhoods. And so we're hoping that these metrics, these indicators, and the way that we're presenting them help bring the focus to not only what the impacts are and how they're distributed across the built environment, but how those impacts are being felt by different types of neighborhoods and what kind of interventions we might want to consider that are targeted at the most impacted. Until Daryl cuts us off, I want to open the floor to you, and I guess I wanted to ask a couple of questions, and maybe I'm going to go back into gallery view if that's okay, so we can see each other. But these are the questions I want you to consider. Were you surprised by any of the information we shared with you so far today? Were there any things that you didn't expect to see that surprised you? And secondly, we're really interested to know whether the way that we're presenting this information has changed your perception of risk for this region one way or the other. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but that's basically the question that I wanted to ask you. And if you don't feel comfortable speaking, please share your thoughts in the chat window. But if you're going to speak, please unmute yourself, identify yourself by name and your organization, and please share your thoughts. Were there any surprises, or was this an effective way for us to communicate our evolving understanding of earthquake risk and its impacts on people?
Hi, Malika here.
Hey, Malika.
Geological survey. I think what struck me is something that I've known from your previous modeling and the difference between kind of daytime and nighttime impacts, but it struck me that similarly in a remote working environment or a pandemic, a lot of the critical injuries you showed in daytime come in the commercial and industrial buildings, and so it struck me that those are somewhat reduced from remote working too. Yeah, but otherwise definitely really interesting and strong patterns. So lots to consider for the services that can reduce downtime injuries.
Thanks, Malika. I hope you enjoyed your breakout session. I hope you learned something new. I don't know if you had time in your session to kind of reflect, but in our session we had just a few minutes to kind of pose this question. Were there any surprises? We're going to go to break shortly, but before we go to break, I just want to set us up. Were there any surprises in the information that we shared with you, and did the way in which we integrate the information to help you see the risk in a new way? So those are really questions that we'd really value your feedback on. And where we're going next, our next breakout session after we take a 10-minute pause, or maybe slightly less than 10 minutes, is we want to think about what the implications of risk reduction are. And we want to think about what specific actions or policies might be most effective, and the consequences of those actions and policies on people. So that's where we're going next. We're going to take a short break. So anyway, thank you so much for hanging in with us. We're going to take a short break. When we do come back, it's an opportunity for you to dig in a bit more and talk amongst the groups. So enjoy the break. We'll see you shortly. Thank you. For the second breakout session, this is going to be more of a discussion amongst each of the groups. And we've looked at the impacts, the physical impacts to the built environment and the consequences of those impacts from the perspective of neighborhoods and varying levels of capacity of those neighborhoods to withstand and recover from those impacts. The question that we want to frame here in the second breakout session is, now that we have a sense of what your concerns are or what the priorities are, what specific actions and or policies do you think would be most effective in promoting and accelerating functional recovery in our region? And we looked at 3 ways, and the questions will really invite you, or the sessions will invite you to suggest actions or policies in any of these 3 categories. So actions that would increase the physical resistance of our buildings, or lessen damage would be another way of thinking about it. These are physical measures that we could take that would change the outcome of recovery. There are other actions that we might consider that would increase our capacity to respond immediately after the event, and or might actually increase the rate at which we can recover. And so think of the planning process, think of permitting process, think of financing, think of all those things that would need to be in place to accelerate the recovery process. And then the last question is really actions or policies that would help us minimize the burden of risk. If we were to implement these measures, there's also the potential that people could be impacted in ways that we can't anticipate right now. And so that's our focus for the breakout sessions. And just before Daryl sends us off to our breakout session 2, I just want to bring us back. This is really what we're talking about. The question that we're asking is, how do we get from orange to blue? How do we envision a different recovery path than the one that we likely will be on if we don't do anything? And so when you go into breakout, the facilitator will get you oriented. but please, this is an opportunity to dig in and share your thoughts with your colleagues and peers here. So with that, this will be, you're just going to be allocated to a breakout session. You'll end up with people that some you know, some you don't know. You'll have a chance to introduce yourself when you speak, and we'll briefly report back on insights at the very end before we wrap up. And so with that, Daryl, I'll ask you to send us to our breakout sessions and meet your facilitators and note takers, and we'll see you back here for a wrap up at the very end.
Hi, my name is Andrew Deelstra. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Victoria, and I'll be facilitating this breakout. So my role here is just to kind of keep the conversation going. Definitely don't want to be talking too much individually here. Definitely want to hear everyone else's thoughts on the three questions or three topics that were posed earlier. So again, I don't know, Murray, do you want to share your screen quick, actually, if you've got those on there so we can keep those in mind. Just as a reminder, those were how can we increase the physical resistance of our communities? And the second point there was accelerating response and recovery functions, and then minimizing the burden of risk on vulnerable populations. So if anyone has any thoughts on those things, we'd love to hear them. Before we split off and talk about those things, we have a note taker here. I assume, can the note taker unmute and introduce yourself briefly?
Hey there, I'm Hannah. I'll be taking the notes. I can't put my video on right now, it's disabled, but yeah, I'll be taking notes in a Google Doc. So please share your thoughts.
Perfect. So I think we can just go through these kind of one by one, maybe topic by topic, if people have thoughts on these things based on the things that you saw in your earlier breakouts. If you had any thoughts from those, please feel free to share those as well. So if you're going to talk, please introduce yourself. Obviously unmute yourself first, and then share your thoughts. So again, to start with, increasing the physical resistance of systems or buildings in the region. So.
Hi, thanks, Andrew. So this is Jack Guo. I'm from Connecticut Risk. So we're practitioners basically helping infrastructure owners sort of manage their risk. And I think, having seen Murray's presentation, one of the things that came to my mind is perhaps thinking from the view of a decision maker. I know that we have highlighted a bunch of regions in North Vancouver and also, towards the East End in Vancouver, where there's lots of industrial buildings, commercial properties that are subjected to damage. And of course, on a macroscopic level, when we say increase the physical resilience of those buildings, it could help. But from a decision maker's perspective, AKA the person who's paying for that, likely what he's thinking is perhaps, how can we disaggregate this risk that you're talking about? Perhaps we can identify low-hanging fruits, because usually that's the first thing that comes up, because it obviously costs less and there's less resistance to kind of implement. I'm just wondering, if we have to kind of mobilize sort of the entire community to expedite the recovery following a major earthquake, we need to kind of persuade these decision makers, people with money and pay at the end of the day, to actually find a way to justify spending in this. So I think one of the first things that we should do is probably make this information public and educate them as much as possible, so that they understand that there's some level of risk. And I think the next step for them to do is identify exactly where that comes from in their particular context. Otherwise, trying to ask people to do seismic retrofit, it's pretty difficult unless you make it a mandatory thing. So, perhaps they can find vulnerabilities within just the utility systems, or maybe they can shift some of their operations to spatially, distributed centers to, create some redundancy in their network. So those are likely lower hanging fruits than going to, physically increase the seismic resilience. Those are just my thoughts.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. That's a really good point. Talking about, not just touching the buildings themselves necessarily, but kind of working within the existing frameworks to distribute that risk and kind of hit the easier things to hit. That's great. Thanks. Anyone else on that point?
Hi, I'm Jenny. I'm a second year community planning student at UBC doing my master's, and just thinking about retrofitting. And so one of the neighborhoods, or thinking about it from residential perspective, is one of the areas that's going to be most affected is those who are in low income housing right now and who are renters with affordability issues. And when you're retrofitting a building, where are those people going to go? And thinking about what can you do to reduce risk without creating a whole nother issue of displacement on a region that already has a lot of housing stress that we've seen on those maps.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Potentially increasing the physical resilience, you end up increasing the burden of risk on those vulnerable populations, which we're obviously hoping to minimize that as well. So those are definitely key points to try to balance out. Do you have any ideas on how to do that, or are you just throwing that out there?
Throwing that out there, that's projects I'm working on. Like, we're trying to think about how to, just thinking about neighborhood resiliency, and also thinking about those populations, how to not necessarily create a bigger problem by trying to like retrofit buildings and things like that. So that's just one of the research questions that we're working on. So figure,
Yeah, great.
Sorry, Jack again here. Just perhaps maybe, I don't know if this is a valid comment. In terms of those high density sort of for highly vulnerable populations, residential areas, another thing to consider is like who own the apartment buildings or the buildings where they live in, and who has the jurisdiction to actually do something about it. And so perhaps it goes back to, do we need a market driver in this? So I would just raise one example is like in Japan and Taiwan, actually both, there is a system of what do you call it, building rating or something that conveys very quickly sort of the seismic resiliency of that building. And there's a price premium associated with that. So potential renters can look at, a particular building what they're interested in. And if they are willing to, pay for that seismic premium, then you get to stay in the more resilient building. And that sort of motivates the private industry, in this case, like a lot of residential REITs, to advertise that and get their buildings qualified for a higher seismic rating, much like, you would in, with the LEED certification. So I wonder if that's another thing that we can think about in terms of actually getting the market to, rewarding people who provide more resilient buildings and vice versa.
Those are great points that you both raised. And also, it's the suggestion that you just brought forward, Jack, is excellent. But we're also being reminded, Jenny's reminding us that those actions could have unintended consequences. Those buildings then become more desirable. It could actually be displacing people from those buildings, and could have an impact, like we saw after Hurricane Katrina, on displacing the most vulnerable and putting them even in a more compromised place than they were before. So, excellent points that you're both raising, and the challenge is how do we bring those insights together to have a more integrated and holistic view when we put our plans together that provides those incentives for building owners, while at the same time understanding the impacts on people that are occupying those buildings. If they're rental facilities, people don't have a voice. They should, but they often don't have a voice to influence the decisions that get made by building owners. So great points. Thank you.
My name is Philip Sir. I work for a geotechnical engineering company, which is a little bit out of this, but I do a lot of risk modeling work. And something that I think could be beneficial, at least that we apply for like huge multi-asset management. Well, we got many sites is an asset management strategy where you catalog, for example, all of the buildings. I don't know what the city of Vancouver does, but if you catalog all the buildings and then you track basically like a relative priority of risk, and then you work your way through the list, essentially, just like in a systematic way, how much does it cost for mitigation? You know, that influences what a relative risk prioritization is, and then you kind of, you do your work, and then eventually, like over time, you can reduce, well, you can reduce risk, but you can also measure your benefit because you've got this like long-term history of management. And it's turned out to work in a lot of kind of major industry type sectors. And I wonder if like the municipal, like the city of Vancouver would adopt such a strategy.
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't know. Personally, I don't know if they do that or not, but that would be a good way to at least know what the risk and resilience of these different areas are in the region. I think that's a great way to do that. Are there any final points on increasing the physical resistance? It looks like we're kind of about a third of our way through our time here, so we might want to move on. You can see on the top right, I don't know if you guys have noticed this or not, you can see how much longer we've got in our breakout, so you're not going to be suddenly shoved back into the main session without knowing it, hopefully. But again, that second point to discuss is talking about accelerating response and recovery functions. So that could take a variety of forms, whether that's increasing the size of repair teams or accelerating the recovery functions like expediting permitting, stuff like that. So if people have any other thoughts on how to do that, please share those.
One thing I've been thinking about with that a little bit, especially I've been looking at it from pandemic perspective. One potentially effective way to manage that is to associate financial drivers to the official community plans and how it ties back to those. And the reason I like that is because so frequently our funding dollars around recovery go a very long way to shaping the community we end up with following the event or the disaster. However, those decisions are often made partly by those who can lobby and support, but also partly by heavy infrastructure projects because they tend to drive a lot of resources to the region rapidly, but they don't always tie to the longer term community plan. And by having a current community plan and then tying your recovery activities back to kind of measuring your activities that you're going to finance against how does this align with the community plan, it does multiple things very quickly. It gives a long-term strategy that was determined before everyone is under stress. It also allows engagement in the community in the weeks or months or years leading up to the event to help ensure all of those voices can have an effective voice in shaping the recovery. And it also gives something measurable to help guide those decisions in the sort of heat of the moment, if you will. So that's a thought anyway.
Vanessa, that's a great thought. Thank you for sharing it. That's I think really where we're trying to go here is can we bring these indicators to the table in a way that they can be incorporated into the community planning process, like a strategic community planning process, where you're looking at targets not only around the physical side of risk reduction, but also around the social side. So that's kind of these resilient cities initiatives are really struggling with how to bring these things together into a more holistic way, but not do it outside the planning functions, actually, bring it into the planning functions more directly. And I think that's the challenge ahead of us. So I'm really glad that you brought that point forward. It's super critical make a connection to those ongoing planning functions.
Just Murray, or Andrew, who's leading it, not Murray. This is Paul Chouinard from Defence R&D Canada. In the pilot study work that we did, by far the biggest risk factor was really, in terms of the economic side, workforce availability. Of course, that's related to the physical damage and everything else, but there's cascading effects that mean that people who are in houses that might be physically undamaged aren't available because those houses aren't livable for one reason or another because of various losses of services within the community. So workforce availability was the number one driver. And, really, it's just like the pandemic. Found that it was very closely, it's not the same as the pandemic, but there was kind of a rhyme with the pandemic is that the indirect economic costs and the social disruption are very closely intertwined. And if you're going to look at, let's say, getting impetus to sort of get people to finance retrofitting of various things, if you look at that broader picture, the indirect costs, which in this pilot study were much, much greater than the direct economic costs. And I didn't even include the effect on national trade that comes through the Port of Vancouver. And the reason I didn't do that in the pilot studies, if I did that, it would have swamped all the other risk factors. But I know Transport Canada does a lot of work in that area, but if the workers aren't there, if the communities aren't there to support the workers, you can retrofit the infrastructure all you like, but you're not going to get the functionality you desire. So you have to look beyond just the physical assets.
I think kind of building on that for the response and capacity and the workforce capacity. So what is the protocol on a national level of having disaster relief workers come in? Are there international agreements that maybe people could come in to do either basic building assessments or speaking with individuals who have been affected about potential disaster survivor assistance that they could access? So in the States, FEMA has a specific sector that will go and will talk to people about disaster survivor assistance. But sometimes when there are hurricanes or too many disaster events that exceed the capacity of these trained individuals at FEMA, they have agreements with other departments, with other agencies within Homeland Security. So they will actually send over other people within the federal government to help out with the disaster survivor assistance. And it's great to have this excess capacity. However, sometimes those people are not trained in the same ways. And when you're talking with a survivor who has just endured a traumatic event, it's, I think, very important to treat them with empathy and with sensitivity, that maybe if you don't have that training, it's harder for you to connect with them and for them to feel safe and for them to tell you their story and about what they need following the disaster event.
The answer varies across industry group. The emergency management organizations, provincial and territorial emergency management organizations have mutual aid agreements. Yes, have they exercised them to the degree that they should? Questionable. The utilities have service agreements with partner utility groups in other regions, so they can send people in. And you do have to coordinate with the Border Services Agency and the Foreign Affairs to make sure those people can come in if they're coming from another country. You get into other issues. If, for example, you're looking at healthcare in terms of whether the people coming in have accreditation. And they had this problem in Katrina. There were doctors willing to go into Louisiana, but they weren't necessarily accredited to do provide health services within Louisiana. So the answer varies depending on industry group. And yes, that could be worked on.
Yeah, and I guess just to follow up on Paul's and Jenny's point, it does seem like, a lot of these infrastructure owners, or critical infrastructure owners, are very case specific. Like I don't know if there's one solution that fits all. So therefore, I'm wondering if the best solution that we can do as a public body is to actually disseminate that information so that we actually create an awareness within the key decision makers, within each of these critical infrastructure portfolio, and have them look at what exactly is impacting their functional recovery, given their context, whether it's a hospital, it's an airport, and whatnot. And from there, they are probably, more well-equipped to identify sort of the vulnerabilities and actually provide a solution that works in their context. Just rather than, trying to push uniformly an upgrade of physical infrastructure or whatnot.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it's sometimes tricky with industry groups or infrastructure operators. They're not always willing to share with each other, or especially talking about their vulnerabilities. They don't necessarily want to be seen that way, but that's a really good point. And that's something that the Pathways project that we're working on is hoping to do a little bit more sharing and creating a little bit more engagement between those groups. Looks like we've only got 4 minutes left here, so I think it'd be good to move on to this last point that we were discussing, minimizing the burden of risk on vulnerable populations. And this has definitely come up in the other 2 points that we've talked about already. So if we can expand on those a little bit again, I think that would be good.
Well, I'll just pipe in and say the pandemic should show us that it's an imperative to support those people, because a lot of those people are in critical industries, as we found in the pandemic. Talking with DHS a week and a half ago, and a similar thing in Canada, is almost half the workforce are in critical industries, essential industries for the country and regions. So, and that includes a lot of people who are vulnerable populations.
I think one of the things we've seen is a lever people try to use, especially around seismic upgrades, is around retrofitting and the buildings that tend to be grandfathered in until there's a renovation. And I'm curious if that is actually a way that we're increasing the burden on our vulnerable populations, because it tends to be the buildings that are not undergoing renovations that continue to be the least kind of scrutinized. And I wonder if it's perhaps a better lever as taxation benefits or something along those lines to drive that seismic upgrades. Anyway, it's an observation.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that it always goes back to those kind of the ownership versus the who's actually there, because you're not going to incentivize an owner to do something if it costs too much, just relying on their level of altruism or empathy that they have for whoever's living in their apartment buildings. If it costs too much, that kind of ends up lower on the priority list there. So if we can incentivize that, using things that do help people make decisions, which tends to be money in a lot of cases, then that's a really good way to do that, I think.
Just a quick, interesting observation of some reading I've been doing recently about in Norway, there's federal legislation that enforces all levels of government to do risk and vulnerability assessments every 4 years. So every municipal government has to pump out one of these assessments, and then so do big infrastructure owners like the roads authority, et cetera. And all of those are there's very codified processes to do those, and then they directly inform emergency management plans. And they have to all these requirements of how to think about vulnerability in interesting ways. But it's a pretty interesting strategy, I think, to get people to keep on the ball of making sure they're considering this in a regular interval.
Yeah, that's great. The knowledge of doing that exercise every 4 years, you said, something like that. That's incredible. So looks like we've only got about 20 seconds left here before we get kicked back into the main group. Thanks everyone for your participation here. Thanks to Hannah for taking notes and uploading those, and I'll see you all back in the main group.
Hey everybody, welcome back. I hope you had a great discussion in your group. So this is really interesting. I'm not sure how it went for you, but if we look at the polling results, it kind of clustered here in the middle. But the range of variability was really impressive. So if we look at, for economic loss, what the range of people's thoughts were in terms of level of concern and opportunity, building damage, critical injuries, and social disruption, you can see that there isn't a consensus here, but there's a lot of work ahead of us. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.